Cities are hubs for productivity, trade, innovation, and employment. They can efficiently supply services and utilities, and they provide superior health and educational services. In America, cities and their immediate surrounding area account for 90% of U.S. economic output. So why are we wasting all this valuable real estate on this? Well, that all comes down to this agonizing law that exists in the vast majority of U.S. cities called minimum parking requirements. So what are minimum parking requirements? Basically, they are the predicted maximum number of spots a business could use at any given time. This is the amount of spots a new business has to create and or maintain in order to operate in that city. Now that doesn't sound too bad. Well, until you take a peek at them. Then you start to notice very quickly how baffling the criteria is. For example, in Tuscaloosa, for clubs or lodges, you're going to need a parking spot per 120 feet of surface area. Want to open a furniture or major appliance store? That'll be 1 per 240 square feet of customer service area plus 1 per employee on the most numerous shift. Each bowling alley parking lot must have 4 spots per alley with additional parking for a restaurant or bar. For funeral homes, you need 20 spots per chapel or parlor, plus 1 per funeral vehicle, plus 1 per employee. If you open a motel with no bar or meeting rooms, you'll need a minimum of 1 spot per room with 2 spots for the loan manager on duty. These requirements beg some serious questions. How much does a motel manager make in order to drive 2 cars to work? How does someone hypothetically apply to be a hotel manager? And what do any of these numbers even mean? I mean, surely there's a concrete mathematical basis for these numbers, right? Well, I've got some bad news. The 2 primary metrics considered across the U.S. when developing minimum parking requirements were 1, guessing, and 2, asking a neighboring town who almost assuredly either asked a different town or also guessed themselves. Another problem is that these parking minimums are archaic. They were created in the 1950s and 60s in a time where significantly more people drove to places like malls, for example. Now, why were these laws created? Well, in the early 1900s through 1910s, cars were only owned by the extraordinary wealthy as a way to flaunt that wealth. But with Henry Ford's invention of the assembly line, cars were everywhere by 1920. These aren't the cars we have today, though. They were incredibly raw, and they were often wielded by someone who was extremely drunk. This situation led to many deaths caused by vehicles on tight city streets that people used for walking. And with no place for parking, people would just park on the street, clogging up the city's operations completely. In 1924 alone, 23,600 people died and 700,000 were injured due to auto accidents, resulting in more than $1 billion in property damage. This surplus of injuries and deaths combined with clogged roads was terrible for business. Many plans were proposed to fix this budding inner-city parking problem. Most notably, William Phelps Eno suggested park-and-rides outside of the city with robust public transportation to get people where they wanted to go, maximizing the use of valuable urban land. Though seemingly a good plan, car companies, and most notably GM, wanted cars to become synonymous with American city streets. The solution that they pushed, and that city after that decided to do, was to force the private sector to handle parking through minimum parking requirements. Now, why are minimum parking requirements so terrible for cities? These completely arbitrary parking stipulations are why so many parking lots are complete wastelands. Minimum parking requirements guarantee sprawl and tons of money wasted in empty parking fields. In many cases, for a business to fulfill these parking requirements, they have to knock down a building or more worth of space for parking. Supporters of large parking lots and the current status quo of minimum parking requirements will stick by minimum parking requirement legislation because they're happy about the convenience that tons of free parking supplies. But in reality, there is no such thing as free parking. The cost of putting down a massive sea of asphalt is that items from stores cost more, plus the city has to extend all of its utilities for that commonly unused space, costing citizens to pay more in tax dollars for land that is rarely used, if at all. Depending on the type of parking spot, individual parking spots cost between $5,000 and $80,000. Minimum parking requirements also prevent downtowns in small to medium-sized cities nationwide from being successful. You would have to bulldoze another business next to it to build a new business. This cost prevents new businesses from popping up, and when they do, it destroys other buildings in the downtown area. Besides the cost, though, from a more philosophical point of view, this begs the question, what do we want our cities to be? Do we want them to be places where we can walk around, enjoy ourselves, shop at local businesses, or even just sit down and watch the world go by? Or do we want them to be dreary places with car-centric infrastructure that we only go because we have to? This comparison comes out when we compare downtown Tuscaloosa and the Strip to McFarland. The proximity of businesses and people-centric infrastructure makes downtown Tuscaloosa a place you actually enjoy existing in. Here you see couples, friends, and families walking, sitting, or even just taking in the vibe. This is a place you go because you want to, not because you have to. Fixing problems deeply rooted in cities like Tuscaloosa is no simple task. task. But the easiest place to start is simple. Get rid of minimum parking requirements. In 2015, Fayetteville, Arkansas, home of the University of Arkansas, became the first city in the country to eliminate commercial parking requirements and let businesses decide how much parking they need for themselves. In Fayetteville, local entrepreneurs have quickly purchased many seemingly unusable buildings, and these businesses are now providing the city with new tax revenue and a greater sense of place for the city's inhabitants. The value that can be generated by turning always empty parking lots in Tuscaloosa, for example, into a space with new businesses, sidewalks, trees, and other urban amenities goes far further than just tax revenue. Like the stripper downtown Tuscaloosa, it becomes a place people want to be. Another crucial issue our cities face is poor street design. Since cars were mass-produced, America went from a place where city streets belong to the people to one that is sprawling, with highways cutting cities in half, and far more parking than necessary. With all that, the next step in car-centric development has been the introduction of a street-road hybrid called STROADS. First, let's go over the difference between a road and a street. Roads are wide, forgiving, have minimal turns, have a clear zone or place that is safe to pull over onto. Signs are large and designed to be read from a distance, and entrances and exits are few and far between. On the other hand, streets are narrow because they are conducive to people walking around and shopping. It is a place that feels safe and comfortable for pedestrians. STROADS are streets designed like roads that do not function correctly in either capacity. They are dangerous, costly, and financially unproductive. They have high speeds and big lanes like roads and lots of turns and driveways like streets. Supporters of such broad and driver-centric city streets will argue that these STROADS are necessary to most efficiently and quickly move cars from place to place. But that is not even the case. Despite high speeds, you cannot even get anywhere quickly due to so much movement, points of conflict, and ever-growing traffic. Due to induced demand, the more lanes you put on a STROAD or highway only increases the number of cars driving on the road, keeping traffic constant. These STROADS create places you only drive to because you absolutely must, and you do anything you can to avoid walking around them. These are places such as McFarland and Skyland Boulevard in Tuscaloosa. The large highway-like designs on a STROAD encourage cars to drive quickly. Combined with a plethora of points of conflict, you get the most dangerous urban driving possible for drivers and pedestrians. STROADS kill more drivers than any other form of driving. The only reason they are not killing more drivers regularly is the traffic. In 2020, during the pandemic, traffic fatalities actually went up in America. As bad as they are for drivers, though, they are even worse for pedestrians. They have massive intersections that make crossing them daunting and very long cycle lengths for crosswalks, with right turns on red or even slip lanes and narrow median islands for pedestrians to wait halfway. Slip lanes are especially hazardous for pedestrians because cars look solely at other vehicles to see when turning is safe and not at the pedestrian. It is the same problem when a pedestrian has to cross a driveway to a business. Everything is car-sized and the speeds are so fast that drivers are not even looking at pedestrians. They also have curb-tight sidewalk without trees or pedestrian protection if a car runs off the road. In 2021, the latest GHSA report stated that 60.4% of pedestrian fatalities happened on such roads, even though not many people walk on these type of roads at all because they are not pedestrian friendly. Generally, the denser the neighborhood, the safer the streets are for pedestrians. Not only are STROADS dangerous, but they are also very costly for cities. More land must be flattened, asphalt and utilities must be extended, and land must be bought up and bulldozed to build new businesses, lowering property value. Large areas also must be dedicated to make parking lots because driving is the only way to get around. Parking lots do not employ anyone or generate revenue for the city. And this loss that STROADS cost is bankrupting American cities just as much as minimum parking requirements are. This sprawl is incredibly financially inefficient and is propped up by more financially efficient downtowns. STROADS do not financially support themselves, and American-style suburbia depends on growth to stay solvent. When these cities stop growing, they fall apart. Due to free parking and massive utility and maintenance costs, you cannot make up of this money in volume after a while, especially if there is a slight economic downturn. This is a severe problem for cities like Tuscaloosa that are currently in a growth phase. That growth phase will stagnate, and with it will come many maintenance costs that Tuscaloosa can simply not afford. Solutions to this are much less straightforward than the minimum parking requirement problem because they require much more investment. The first step for a city like Tuscaloosa, though, is to turn STROADS into either streets or roads. For the roads, make traffic flow separate from businesses and other forms of transportation so people can drive at high speeds unencumbered. For the streets, make the roads smaller and the buildings closer together and closer to the street while changing parking to on-street parking. As a whole, Tuscaloosa and the United States would benefit greatly by taking these measures separating roads and streets that we see in other places such as the Netherlands. Tuscaloosa's infrastructure is hindering it from reaching its full potential as a city. Sizable and empty parking lots and unsafe or cost-efficient streets have made an impact on every city inhabitant. With better education on how these problems affect Tuscaloosa specifically, we will have taken a considerable step forward to address this critical problem at hand. The quicker we get rid of stroads and minimum parking requirements, the more opportunity Tuscaloosa has to spend on other critical monetary problems affecting the city. Overall, making any city look nice is also just a great investment for all of its inhabitants. To maximize their value, cities should be places people truly want to be, not just places you go to because you have to.